Hi everybody, I'm Ho Chang. In this unit, I will be introducing you to quantitative, qualitative, and mixed methods research. Upon completion of this unit, you will be able to describe the different characteristics of quantitative and qualitative studies. You should also be able to analyze the different purposes, assumptions, and situations in which quantitative and qualitative approaches should be used. Finally, you should also be able to design a mixed methods study that uses both quantitative and qualitative approaches. Researchers usually use quantitative, qualitative, or mixed method approaches depending on their research. Your research purpose may determine the approach that you are going to use. Each approach has its own strengths and weaknesses depending on the situation. All these approaches can be used for honors projects and capstone projects.
Quantitative studies aims to explain the observed phenomenon using numbers and statistics. They focus on testing theories and hypotheses and the generalizability of the findings. Common methods include experimental studies and survey research. Qualitative studies deal with non-numerical data such as text, pictures, video, audio recordings. They don't aim to test theories. Instead, they focus on developing theories and exploring ideas. They provide an in-depth understanding and insights about the things they look at. Common methods include observation, interviews, focus groups, and case studies. Theoretical characteristics.
Quantitative studies could be described as atomistic, materialistic, decontextualized, outsider perspective, deductive, etc. Qualitative studies are often described as holistic, naturalistic, contextual, insider perspective, and others. Some studies aim only to formulate a hypothesis. Other studies aim to confirm a hypothesis. Usually, qualitative studies aim to formulate a hypothesis. Quantitative studies normally aim to confirm a hypothesis. Qualitative studies usually begin without an hypothesis. As the study proceeds, more data is collected, and gradually you formulate your own hypotheses. That means the hypotheses are the outcome of your studies. However, quantitative studies usually begin with a hypothesis. Then the data is connected, and then you try to use the data to confirm your hypothesis. Another way to say it is, according to the classic work of Glaser and Strauss, that some studies aim to verify a theory. Other studies aim to discover a theory. If you want to verify a theory, you begin with a theory, collect data, see whether the data support your theory. You are trying to verify that your theory is correct. But if you want to discover a theory, you begin by collecting data, trying to discover new ideas or theories. At the end, you have a theory unknown to you at the beginning. Let's look at an example to explain the difference between verifying a theory and discovering a theory. A researcher thinks children's happiness is related to how much free time they have. He then examines the happiness of a group of children, as well as their free time. Finally, he checks if there is any relationship between the two methods. From this example, we can see that the researcher begins with an idea that the happiness of children is related to their free time. To verify this idea, the researcher chooses to collect data on the children's happiness and their free time, but nothing else. Finally, the researcher confirms that the relationship, that is his idea at the beginning, is supported by the result. Now, if instead we are interested in discovering a theory about children's happiness, the process would look like this. A researcher begins with an open mind. He interviews a group of children and asks them what factors are related to their happiness. From the interview data, he identifies a number of factors that may be related to happiness. And these factors become the outcome of the studies. In this example, the researcher begins without fixed ideas. With an open mind, he interviews the children, and from the interview, he arrives at a certain theory. And so, the identified factors are the outcome of his studies. Another way to decide whether to use a quantitative or qualitative methods is by using emic or ethic approach. An emic approach describes behavior or belief in terms of the meaningfulness it has to a person, consciously or unconsciously. That is, an emic approach comes from a person within a particular culture. In contrast, an ethic account describes behavior or belief in terms that can be applied across different cultures. That is, an ethic account attempts to be culturally neutral. Let's look at an example. A researcher wants to study childhood intelligence. With an emic approach, the researcher will interview the children to see what clever means to them. That is, the meaning of clever is not defined by the researcher, but is defined by the children. The researcher finds that children think that those who can play a certain trick in a game are clever. This then is the meaning of cleverness as defined by the children. Using an ethic approach, the researcher will use a standard instrument, such as an IQ test to measure the intelligence of children. As such, the meaning of cleverness is related to what the researcher had in his mind, that is IQ. At the end, the researcher will find the average intelligence score of the children. We can now see that the use of an ethic approach means that a researcher uses his own understanding of what cleverness is and so uses to measure the children. Deductive reasoning and inductive reasoning can also help you determine whether quantitative or qualitative approaches should be used. In deductive reasoning, a researcher begins with a theory, and from there he narrows his theory down into specific hypotheses that can be tested operationally as data is connected. In other words, a theory moves from being general to being specific hypotheses that can be tested. For inductive reasoning, a researcher begins with specific and concrete observations, and from there he detects patterns or regularities. He formulates a tentative hypothesis for further exploration. He finally ends up with some general conclusion or theories. In deductive reasoning, you begin with something abstract or general, but arrive at specific conclusions. But for inductive reasoning, you begin with specific observation, find general patterns, and end with general conclusions. Let's look at an example. Deductive reasoning. Every time it takes me 60 minutes to go to EDU from my home. Tomorrow, my class will start at 9:30. Therefore, if I leave home at 8:30 tomorrow morning, I will be on time. Inductive reasoning. Today, I left for EDU at 8:30 and arrived on time at 9:30. Yesterday, I left at 8:32 and was also on time. As such, if I leave home at 8:30 every day, I can arrive at the classroom on time. As you can see, deductive reasoning starts with something general. The journey to EDU takes 60 minutes. I arrive at a specific conclusion. If I leave home at 8:30 tomorrow, a specific conclusion just for tomorrow, then I will be on time tomorrow. But for inductive reasoning, I start with something specific. I left home at 8:30 today, just today, and then I arrive at something general. If I leave home at 8:30 every day, then I will be on time every day. We can now talk about the differences between qualitative and quantitative research approaches. The two approaches differ not only in the kind of data collected, there are actually different methodological assumptions behind your study. Quantitative studies aim to confirm a hypothesis and to verify a certain theory. Researchers describe results from an ethic perspective, from the perspective of the researchers, and uses deductive reasoning from abstract to concrete. Qualitative studies aim to formulate a hypothesis and to discover a theory. Researchers describe the result from an emic perspective, from the perspective of the participants, and uses inductive reasoning from concrete to abstract. Quantitative and qualitative approaches are generally associated with these different methodological assumptions. Yet, these are just general association, and there are many exceptions. Generally speaking, a quantitative approach follows the description on the left of the table, while a qualitative approach follows those on the right. Both quantitative and qualitative approaches have limitations. Here is an example of a study that investigates children's understanding of the idea that the world is round. Using a quantitative approach, you may arrive at the result that children can successfully understand that the world is round. But using a qualitative approach, you can see what the children actually understand in the 6 pictures on the right drawn by the children. They understand the world is round differently, although they all say the world is round. Qualitative studies have their own limitation too. Qualitative studies are usually highly related to individual researcher, so the quality of qualitative study greatly depends on the researcher. Moreover, it is difficult to repeat any aspect of a qualitative study because the student, teachers, school, classroom environment, and everything are all different. As such, it's very hard for a researcher to repeat the study of a previous researcher, and so almost impossible to confirm or deny the result of a qualitative studies. Okay, let's see a more concrete example and see how our understanding of the quantitative and qualitative approach can be used to analyze a study. In this example, Professor Smart is testing a method to help children learn Chinese characters. 64 children in the experimental group received this method. On average, they learned 3.2 characters. However, the 65 children in the control group learned 6.8 characters. One child in experimental group, Ho Ho, learns 8 characters and becomes greatly interested in learning characters. This can be seen in the video taken in the classroom. And another child, Chang, learns 7 characters. His parents report during an interview that the child recently becomes able to recognize many characters at home. We can look at this study from 2 different perspectives. If you look at the study from a quantitative perspective, the teaching method is not as effective as that of the control group because, on average, the experimental group only learned 3.2 characters while the control group learned 6.8 characters. As such, your conclusion may be that the new teaching method is not as useful or as effective as the normal approach. However, if you use a qualitative perspective, and if you have a more open mind, and you want to find out what actually happens when this method is used, you will see that there are some children in the experimental group who perform differently than before. Then, our conclusion may be, out of our expectation, some of the children are found to become more interested in learning characters, and they actually become active learners in recognizing the characters. And the evidence is from the teacher and parental observation, so again, the approaches that you use may influence your conclusions. The limitation of the quantitative approach is that we just focus on one particular aspect. In this example, the number of characters learned, even though there are other effects, such as the children become more motivated, these are neglected. Aspects that are difficult to measure are sometimes ignored if we use a quantitative approach. In contrast, the limitation of the qualitative approach is that even though the children become more interested, we cannot say that the method is very effective. The effect in terms of the number of characters learned, what we originally regarded as important, is insignificant. There are 2 types of research questions. One type is, say, is approach A more effective than approach B? This question is asked in a closed-ended way. And for this closed-ended question, the answer is usually just yes or no. Because of this, quantitative studies describe the results in numbers. By using numbers, the researcher comes up with a specific answer, whether yes, approach A is more effective than approach B, or no. But for other research questions, such as, in what ways is approach A more effective than B? This is an open-ended question. The researchers want to find out the different ways approach A is more effective and how approach A can do something different from the approach B. As such, you will answer this open-ended question and describe your result in text. Text is more flexible so that you can freely describe all aspects of your results. We are now ready to put both quantitative and qualitative methods together in one study. This study investigates a new teaching method. The quantitative part includes the research question: is the teaching method effective? Participants or the student in both the experimental and the control group. There are a large number of students involved in this part because it is a quantitative study. When do we collect the data? Before and after the use of the teaching method. What data will be collected? The performance of the student in the pre and the post test. Another part of the study uses the qualitative approach. The research question is, in what ways is the teaching method effective? This is a more open-ended question. Participants, teachers, and some of the students in the experimental group, representative group of the students. We will focus on the student in the experimental group because the new method is only used in the experimental group. When to collect the data? Maybe during the use of the teaching method. What data will be collected? The dialogue between the teachers and the students as observed in the classroom. You can see that for the quantitative part, you have certain research questions, you choose specific participants, and you collect some sort of data. But for the qualitative part, you have another set of research questions, a different group of participants, and other specific method for collecting the data. You can now see that the two parts can be put together in one project or one study. But one very important thing is, don't mix up the two parts. This means you cannot answer an open-ended research question by measuring a very narrow aspect of the participants. So, the most important thing is, if you start with a quantitative research question, then all the way you follow the quantitative approach. If you start otherwise with the qualitative approach, you all the way follow the same qualitative approach. Mixed methods research refers to studies in which researchers use multiple ways to explore a research problem. They utilize both quantitative and qualitative approaches and integrate findings and draw inference from multiple sources. Mixed methods research has been used for decades, for quite a long time, but yet it has recently become more prominent. Upon completion of this unit, you should be able to describe the different characteristics of quantitative and qualitative studies, analyze the different purposes, the different assumptions, the different situations in which a quantitative or a qualitative approach is to be used. Design a mixed method study that use both quantitative and qualitative approaches in one study.